Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC, and your host. As the snow and ice fall here in Washington, I suppose the single good piece of news is weather doesn't force us to cancel a program. And believe me, you do not want to miss today's program. Before I get to our guest, Ellie Cohanim, here is your JPC commercial. We were established in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can sign up for our Insight articles and our magazine In Focus Quarterly. The spring issue of In Focus Quarterly will be out by the end of March and will consider priorities for Congress and the administration. We think there are a lot of them. Join us for that. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. That last one should probably be up front. In this series of webinar calls, and we are approaching the one-year anniversary of the JPC webinar series, we have been very pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China in various permutations, Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, Israel's relations with China, the Abraham Accords, Iran sanction and side trips on American defense, and the US Supreme Court. We are back to Iran today, but where we previously had focused on Iran's quest for nuclear weapons capability and support for terrorism around the world, today we're going to look at Iran from a human rights point of view, with a focus on the Iranian government's fomenting of anti-Semitism. Now your public service announcement. You are muted, but you can send questions during the presentation by using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Please do not send emails to our info address. We are using the Q&A function on Zoom. Our guest today is the remarkable Ellie Cohanim, who was until recently Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. She has an extensive background fighting anti-Semitism and promoting religious equality, with decades of advocacy, policy development, journalism, and public speaking. She was Senior Vice President of the Jewish Broadcasting Service, where she also did on-air reporting. Her media experience includes anchoring major international gatherings when there were major international gatherings, and we imagine she'll do it again. Her anchoring includes the Israel President's Conference, live from Jerusalem, the AIPAC Conference, Jewish Federation General Assembly, the Jerusalem Post Conference, live in New York, and dozens of others. Before that, she was an officer at Yeshiva University, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and the UJA Federation of New York. Ellie has served on the boards of the American Jewish Committee, New York region, New York Jewish Community Relations Council, and the Esther chapter of Hadassah, as well as an array of nonprofit boards that focus on educating and advocating for religious freedom and fairness, both domestically and internationally. She is a graduate of Barnard College and has done graduate study at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she is a graduate of NYU's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Ellie was born in Iran. Her family fled during the Islamic Revolution in 1979 amidst increasing anti-Semitism. She is fluent in Farsi and Hebrew, but we've asked her to present in English, please. Ellie Cohanim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shoshana, for that really warm and kind introduction. And I have to tell you, I'm so thrilled to be joining JPC. As you mentioned, the work that JPC does just has tremendous impact on the policy conversation in the United States and internationally. And so I'm really, really pleased to be joining you. Thank you very much for having me. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. Before I begin my formal remarks, I just want to note that I'd like to dedicate my talk today to the memory of Sufi political prisoner Behnam Mahjoubi, who we learned on Tuesday was drugged to death by the authorities in Iran. And I specifically send our warm wishes of condolences to his mother, who on social media, there's a video of her sharing her distraught and crying for the loss of her son. And so I just want Behna Mahjoubi's mother to know that she's not alone and we hear her cries. And so now to begin my formal remarks. From its inception, during the 1979 revolution in Iran, when the Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamist backers seized power in Iran, the regime launched a reign of terror against the citizens of Iran, with the early days of the revolution being focused on mass arrests and executions of the would-be potential rivals of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And ironically and sadly, the vanguards of the left who had helped the Khomeinyists topple Iran's Shah then found themselves on the execution line. Today, the Islamic Republic of Iran has established a vast system for the express purpose of abusing the citizens of Iran, all in the efforts to maintain the regime's power and for the state to maintain control over the people of Iran. I will be elaborating today on the security state that the regime has created. I'll also elaborate on the regime's human rights violations, although I have to say that the violations are so vast that there's really no way that anyone could do justice to that subject in one talk. I'll also be addressing the regime's anti-Semitism, which the Islamic Republic has used, along with its system of rights abuses, to maintain control also over the Jewish population of Iran, along with all citizens of Iran. I also want to state at the outset of our conversation that what I believe makes this discussion especially significant at this moment in time is the Biden administration's stated desire to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Presumably, rejoining this effort would require negotiations with the Iranian regime. And so I urge the Biden administration to not overlook both the regime's horrific anti-Semitism, with their on-the-record genocidal calls to, quote, eliminate Israel, as stated by the Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei himself, nor should the Biden administration overlook the regime's horrific human rights violations. As Iranian dissidents have stated, the Iran file is not just a nuclear file, it is also a human rights file. Indeed, in recent weeks, we saw an open letter written by Iranian dissidents in Iran putting their very lives at risk by writing this letter to President Biden, urging his support for their demands for a secular democracy, but also respect for their human rights in Iran. In fact, the Islamic Republic of Iran has created a vast security state system through the use of three organs of the state. The first is the judiciary, which has become notorious for its travesties of justice. The second is the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, known also as MOIS. And finally, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC intelligence organization, and its subdivision within it, the Basij militias. Now, you will note on this list that there's a redundancy between the traditional intelligence agency, the MOIS, and the IRGC intelligence organization. This redundancy is by design, according to Udit Barnea of Johns Hopkins and Dr. Raz Zimt of the Mayor Amit Intelligence and Terrorism Center. It was in the aftermath of the 2009 street protests, which took place after widespread belief among Iranians that the elections had been fraudulent. Millions of Iranians poured into the street. And thereafter, Iran's intelligence apparatus underwent its largest reorganization since the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989. This reorganization was made by the Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei himself, and it led to the expansion of scope and strengthening of the IRGC intelligence branch. The establishment of the IRGC intelligence organization gave the Supreme Leader and the Iranian leadership a greater ability to control the means of repression and surveillance, with the IRGC reporting directly to the Supreme Leader. What one can deduce from this reorganization is that Khamenei presumably felt that the very fact of the 2009 Green Movement street protests was a failure of the intelligence service, and he set out to create a more effective system for the next time. The IRGC intelligence organization then went on to conduct a secret purge within the Moys, thereby solidifying their own control of Iran's intelligence apparatus, and also a key point here, weakening the government's ability to challenge the IRGC in cracking down on dissent. The new IRGC intelligence structure includes 7 separate intelligence and security divisions, including Khamenei's personal intelligence office known as Department 101, the Internal Security Directorate within the Moys, the Security Directorate of the Basij, and the Cyber Defense Command. Altogether, the intelligence organization has a decentralized structure, allowing the branch to operate in centers present in Iran's 31 provinces, giving them a reach literally in every corner of the large country. The intelligence organization is also responsible for running the A2 ward of the notorious Evin prison in Tehran, which is used for jailing political dissidents. Now, finally, under the umbrella of the IRGC is also the Basij militia, which has as its chief mission the repression of internal dissent. The Basij is a volunteer paramilitary force with about 90,000 active members. However, when fully mobilized, the Basij is capable of commanding 1 million men across the country. The main mission of the Basij is riot control, with case in point being their brutal suppression of the 2009 protest movement, including attacks on student dormitories, beatings of students and protesters. There were reports of the Basij members armed with clubs and chains beating anyone suspected of participating in the 09 Green Movement protests. So what we find here is a picture of a vast, decentralized, lionized security apparatus which bypasses the government, reports directly to the supreme leader, and with its chief mission to quell domestic opposition to the regime. As I mentioned earlier, the judiciary in Iran also plays a significant role in this web of forces all working together to repress Iran's people. The judiciary is headed by the cleric Ebrahim Raisi, is dominated by conservatives, and has been condemned by numerous human rights organizations for the court system's collusion with the intelligence agencies in denying Iranians any semblance of due process. In fact, the US Department of the Treasury placed sanctions on Ebrahim Raisi himself in November 2019 for allowing torture, extrajudicial killings, and repression of civilians. The Treasury statement went on to report on Iran's judiciary sanctioning the execution of 9 children and Raisi's personal involvement in the regime's brutal crackdown of the Green Movement, as well as his participation in a so-called death commission that ordered the extrajudicial killing of thousands of political prisoners in 1988. I want to take a moment now to also discuss the regime's anti-Semitism, which I have called an obsessive anti-Semitism, in that anti-Semitism motivates everything that the regime does, including their oppression of the local Jewish population. Iran's Jews trace back their ancestry thousands of years to ancient Persia, but the majority of Jews escaped Iran due to the rising anti-Semitism of the revolution in 1979, which Shoshana mentioned, included myself and my family. One of the regime's earliest acts of power was the execution of the leader of the Jewish community, Mr. Habib El-Ghannaian, in May 1979. Since that time, 14 Iranian Jews have been executed by the regime. Numerous Jews have been falsely accused of spying for Israel. The Jewish community lives under sanctioned discrimination, which includes in the areas of employment, education, and public accommodations. All this while they live under the steady drumbeat of a government that chants death to Israel and announces its desire to eliminate the Jewish state at every turn. When confronted about their anti-Semitism, the regime typically likes to point to the Jewish community and say something along the lines of, "Look at our happy Jews," turning the Jewish community into a mere prop for their propaganda. The Jews of Iran, however, live in daily fear. They fear government reprisals if they draw attention to the mistreatment of their community. In fact, one of the tactics perfected by the regime is collective punishment, whereby individuals understand that if they cross the regime, their families, their friends, their ethnic group or religious group, all may be on the receiving end of violence and abuse by the regime for their individual actions. According to the US State Department's annual human rights reports, as well as numerous human rights organizations, including Amnesty, HRW, IranHumanRights.org, and countless other organizations, the long list of the regime's human rights violations include routine, arbitrary, or unlawful killings and arrests, torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, forced confessions often gained through torture, airing of forced confessions on national media, unfair trials with no semblance of due process, rape and sexual abuse, inhumane punishments, executions, disappearing of individuals, repression of civil liberties, including press freedom, internet freedom, academic freedom, and freedom of peaceful assembly, and discrimination against women, girls, and the LGBT community and ethnic and religious minorities. This vast system created in the aftermath of the 2009 Green Movement protests set the stage for the next wave of popular protests, which all Iran observers and the regime themselves knew was the inevitable, and which came in late 2017 to 18 and again in November 2019, when millions of Iranians poured into the streets, initially to protest the government's abrupt raise in gasoline prices, but eventually demonstrators gathered in more than 100 cities and towns all across Iran, demanding the Islamic Republic's government's downfall and demanding for its leadership to step down. The regime responded to the protests with a most brutal crackdown, with the unprecedented move of shooting live ammunition at demonstrators, which ultimately left over 1,500 people dead, over 7,000 individuals wounded. And of course, there was the mass arrests which followed, leaving over 12,000 people detained in Iran's prisons, all for protesting. While at the same time, there was a near total shutdown of the internet, of the global internet in the country, which made it impossible for the outside world to receive real-time information on what was taking place within the country. This brutal crackdown effectively ended the November 2019 protests. But then just 2 months later, the Iranian people once again poured out onto the streets in January 2020, when the regime finally confessed to downing a Ukrainian airliner, killing all 176 passengers and crew. Protesters identified the entire regime as perpetrators and once again chanted the slogans of the November protests, "Death to the dictator," and so on. But within 2 days of the January protests beginning, we saw plainclothes police, revolutionary guards on motorcycles, and riot police out in tremendous force. Again, there was the use of live ammunition, rubber bullets, tear gas, and police using batons to beat people on the streets. The regime's methodology, it's important to understand, does not end at crushing protests in the moment of protests, but goes on to cruelly punish and oppress any Iranian who would dare speak out against the regime at any moment in time, such that the authorities in Iran systematically arrest, detain, and torture human rights activists, civil society activists, and women's rights activists. They also systematically arrest, detain, and torture the attorneys who dare represent these activists. And they will at times arrest, detain, and torture the family members of these activists. To share just a few of these stories, the list of those being held by the authorities in Iran is so long. Again, I can't do justice to it, but the Woodrow Wilson Institute has some profiles, and I'm going to share just a few stories so everyone gets a taste of what is taking place in Iran. First is the case of Saba Khord Afshari, who's a women's rights activist that campaigned against mandatory hijab laws. In August 2018, Saba was arrested at a rally protesting government corruption and charged with disruption of public order. She was sentenced to 1 year and released after time served. In June 2019, Afshari posted a video of herself without the headscarf during the White Wednesday protest. She was then arrested for, quote, encouraging people to commit immorality and or prostitution. Now, again, this is because she wasn't wearing the headscarf. And she was sentenced to a total of 24 years in prison. Security officials then detained her mother to pressure Afshari into confessing to this crime on state television. Her request for a retrial was rejected, and as of November 2020, she still remains in Evin prison. Next, I want to share the story of Arash Saderi, who was detained in July 2009 during the Green Movement protests, but was released without formal charges. His mother reportedly suffered a heart attack during a security raid on their home in November 2009. She died 4 days later. In 2010, Saderi was charged with assembly and collusion against national security and was sentenced to 6 years. Following his sentencing, he was repeatedly released and detained, released and detained. This is another game that the regime plays. Until 2015, when he was yet again arrested and charged with propaganda against the regime and insulting the founder of the Islamic Republic. He was sentenced to 19 years. In 2018, Saderi developed bone cancer. He was temporarily released for surgery, but was denied post-surgical care, and he's still in Evin prison. In just these two individual stories, you understand the regime's tactics of arresting and detaining activists, demanding false confessions, intimidating family members, sometimes causing the death of family members, denying medical care, and so on. We also have stories of Iranian attorneys who are arrested and detained for the fact that they try to represent these activists. The most famous, of course, of Iran's attorneys is Nasrin Sotoudeh, who she is the most prominent human rights lawyer, a vocal critic of its judicial process, treatment of women, and the death penalty. She represented Nobel Prize winner Shirin Ebadi, as well as women's rights activists, victims of domestic abuse, minors on death row, journalists, and Kurdish rights activists. Following the 2009 protests, Sotoudeh represented the families of demonstrators killed by the government. She was arrested after a raid on her home in 2010 and was charged with, quote, propaganda against the system. Sotoudeh has a history of, she was released, she was arrested again, so I can't go through all of it. But I just want to go to August of 2020, when she went on hunger strike to demand that political prisoners be released in light of the COVID pandemic, which was raging through Iran, and the prison conditions are horrible, as you can imagine, incredibly overcrowded. So she went on hunger strike, and 6 days later, agents raided her home and arrested her 20-year-old daughter as an intimidation tactic to get her to stop the hunger strike. Nasrin later contracted the coronavirus herself and is still in prison today. So again, what we learn from these stories is that dissent in Iran comes with a dear cost. And even the very attorneys who try to represent civil rights and human rights activists will pay the price themselves and possibly their family members. Finally, I want to speak a little bit about executions in Iran. Iran has the distinguished title as the world's leading executioner per capita. We've been witness to a spate of executions in December, but the two I think that have caught the most international attention. The first was the journalist Ruhollah Zam, who was, believe it or not, living in France and running an opposition news website. Well, he was lured to Iraq, and in September 2019, the Iranian agents kidnapped him, brought him to Iran, and hanged him. The second case, which garnered a lot of attention, was Navidafkari, who was a world famous wrestler and was accused by the regime of murdering a security guard during his participation in the anti-government protests in 2018. Now, Afkari said he was tortured into making this confession. And despite the very huge and international outcry against it, the regime proceeded with executing Navid by hanging him this last September. I think that Navidafkari's story is really the quintessential one in proving my thesis that the Iranian regime, through the direct guidance of the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, systematically uses the organs of the state to abuse the citizens of Iran in order to maintain state control. The message to the regime sent to the Iranian people by executing Navidafkari was clear. The regime will stop at nothing to retain power, and no Iranian, no matter how famous, can step in its way. Time and again, the regime has chosen to use these tools of violence, abuse, and repression against Iran's people's legitimate calls for the country's resources to be used at home rather than for funding terrorism abroad, their calls for free and fair elections, and their desire to live in a normal country. The question for the United States at this moment in time is, what role do we want to play in the Iranian people's quest for freedom and basic human rights? The reality is that the Biden administration has Iran exactly where you would want them to be in any negotiation. Iran's economy is reeling from US sanctions from the previous administration. The people have shown their will time and again to confront the regime, and the country is struggling still with the COVID pandemic. The regime is incredibly weak and left vulnerable right now. Therefore, the policy solutions are rather simple, I would argue. The United States can hold the regime accountable for their flagrant violations of the fundamental rights of the people of Iran. We must maintain the humanitarian values, which are the very foundational essence of the United States. And with that, demand the Iranian regime stop the executions and release all political prisoners. Any US contemplation of sanctions relief on Iran or deal making with Iran must be contingent upon the regime bringing to a complete halt their heinous human rights violations, and must require the dismantling of the security apparatus system, which I detailed today, created for the express purpose of repressing Iranians. Only then will the regime hold an ounce of legitimacy in the eyes of the Iranian people. And only then will it be morally correct for the United States to engage with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And with that, I thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ellie. That is really depressing. One of our listeners writes, the Iranian Republic is like the old Soviet Union and present-day Russia, using psychiatric clinics, medications, electric shock, all of those things which we understand to be the worst kinds of violations of civil rights and human rights, resulting, as you say, in the deaths of people. And by the way, we add our condolences to the family of Behnam Mahjoubi and Navidafkari and others. What do we do about it? The US government appears to was in the previous administration, and now we'll get to the current administration, heavily influenced by the problems of Iranian nuclear capability and the Iran deal, the JCPOA. Have we as a country done anything specifically to punish Iran for human rights violations? And the IOC hasn't either, the International Olympic Committee, on Afkari, right? So have we dropped that?
So Shoshana, yes, the IOC has not made the move, even though there have been dissidents, Iranian dissidents calling for that. And so to get to US policy options, as I just stated, I believe that the Biden administration does have an opportunity right now, because they are considering re-engaging with the regime, because they are considering apparently sanctions relief and re-entering the JCPOA. This is a moment that the administration really needs to take an accounting. and really say, well, we have this opportunity. The regime is weak. They clearly want to negotiate with the United States of America. They desperately need sanctions relief. So, in terms of bargaining, which, the Iranians are famous for that, right? It's a culture. It's a culture of negotiation. It's a culture of the bazaar. And I would say that with the Obama administration, the Iranians really won that one in terms of their negotiation. They negotiated hard. They got what they wanted. And so, they've started the negotiation already with America. So now the United States is at this point where we actually have all the chips, right? Again, the regime is weak. They need sanctions relief desperately. And so why not hold them accountable for the human rights violations? As I said, it's very simple. The Iranian regime can release all political prisoners. They can stop the executions. They can stop the mass arrests. And those would be just the first steps. And certainly they should dismantle the system that they've set up, all meant to survey and to abuse Iranian citizens.
Here's another question from our listeners. Given that governments generally don't put themselves out of business, neither good ones nor bad ones don't generally say, okay, fine, I've had it, I'm going home. How likely is it, how possible is it, and could it happen with some encouragement that the Iranian people will continue the rebellion that they showed in 2017 and 2019, or has that been closed off to them? To the extent that it's closed off, how much is pandemic related and how much is related to the repression and the deaths and the arrests? How much is the Iranian government winning?
Okay, I'll say this, that I don't think the people of Iran are ever going to give up. And so the regime winning by repressing the people, that's not actually a winning strategy. They're not going to win by basically trying to kill everybody. I mean, what's the option here? So, the people of Iran, their demands are very normal. Again, they're asking for resources to be spent within the country rather than funding terrorism abroad. They're asking for a normal country with transparency, with democracy that's representative. And so what the Iranian people are requesting is indeed very rational. And so the regime should itself choose the rational path and give the people the requests that they're demanding. It's really rather an easy choice for the regime. I agree that no government will choose its own death one day. So the regime, though, has the ability, in fact, to be responsive to its citizenry and therefore maintain power by being responsive to what the people are demanding, which again, their demands are not, the people's demands are not unusual or exceptional. It's up to the regime to make the right choices and to give the people what they want. And
we could help by making that clear.
Exactly right.
Our government.
Yes, exactly right.
Here's a question under the question. We tend to talk about the Iranian government and the Iranian people. How unified are the Iranian people? About 40% of the population, we understand, is from non-Persian tribes and ethnic groups. How similar are they in their political aspirations to Persian ethnic Iranians or any other? Is there a difference among the groups as they approach the government?
Look, I will tell you that, and I think I tried to touch on this in my remarks, that there is no ethnic or religious group, there's no man, woman, or child who's spared the repression of the regime, other than, of course, the regime and their cronies themselves, right, who are stealing the country's resources and grabbing power and so on. But so if you don't happen to be part of the leadership, if you're not a regime crony, if you're not a member of the IRGC, if you're not not somehow, feeding off of the system that the regime has set up, you are not spared. And so in terms of Iran is actually a very diverse country in terms of the ethnic populations. There's the Arab Ahwazis, there's the Kurds, there's a number of ethnic minority groups, and then there's a variety of religious groups. There's of course Sunni Muslims, there's the Sufis, there's Jews, as I mentioned earlier, there are Christians, and there are Iranian Muslims who've converted to Christianity, who also are always on the receiving end of tremendous human rights abuses for doing so. And there's the Baha'i, who again also receive tremendous, they're on the tremendous receiving end of human rights abuses in Iran for the practice of their faith. And so what I would say that all the minority groups have in common is that they are each repressed and oppressed by the regime. And that's what I think brings really everybody together. And if you think about what took place in the 2019 protests in November 19, there were literally millions of Iranians in over 100 cities and towns across the country who took to protest. And so I would say that that is a good indication that that really everybody, every individual in Iran, no matter what their specific background is, there is a tremendous amount of frustration and really just almost to the point of, I would say, hatred by many towards the regime for the treatment of Iran citizenry.
We had a listener pop in with a question specifically on the Baluchi minority. Can you just tell our listeners who they are and what their goal is?
I mean, I like I said, there's a tremendous amount of ethnic diversity in Iran, and I think if you look at the Middle East in general, that's part of the puzzle that I think is sometimes hard for the West to understand, that there is a tremendous amount of ethnic and religious diversity in the Middle East. And so sometimes when people in the West try to kind of create policies, there is an overlooking of the fact that there are these very separate identities that go back for people thousands of years.
Thank you. So now put them all back together. Would you say that there is a difference, first of all? You talked about anti-Semitism. In European anti-Semitism and Iranian anti-Semitism, and the sub-question to that is, how do the Iranian people, as opposed to the government, feel about Jews and about Israel?
Yeah, that's a great question. Shoshana, what I would point to in the recent protests, what we saw was some videos got out of Iran where you see on the streets the Israeli flag and the US flag painted on the ground. And so there was this viral video that was going around social media where you see Iranians, these flags are painted on the ground so that the Iranian people will step on the flag, on Israel's flag, right, for example. And what you see in this viral video was that Iranians are jumping over this flag painted on the ground so that they don't step on the Israeli flag. And I would say that, again, the Jews in Iran have an ancient history there. We were part and parcel of society. And so, with my own family as an example, we were friends and neighbors and business associates with our Muslim neighbors. And I have heard time and again from Muslim friends who tell me that, my best friend, people who are still in Iran will say, my best friend was this Jewish boy in my class, and then 79 came, or 83, and he suddenly left. And, to this day, I miss him. He was my best friend. I think that the people of Iran have this long history going back to Cyrus of tolerance. Now, look, I don't want to whitewash all of Iranian and Persian history. I would tell you that the history of the Jews of the Middle East in general, because it's rather long, there was anti-Semitism, certainly at times, and it all depended on who the ruler was at that moment in time. So there were certainly times in history in the Middle East when the Jews faced pogroms and they faced forced conversions to Islam and so on. At the same time, with this very ancient history spanning thousands of years, there were also very, very good times in those years where Jews were accepted as brothers and sisters. And so I would posit that despite the regime's daily efforts to brainwash its population, to hate Jews and to hate Israel, the people of Iran don't harbor that hatred. And I think every day that goes by, the people of Iran understand who their oppressors are, and their oppressors are the mullahs. And so the mullahs are the same people oppressing the Iranian people. They're the same people oppressing the Jews of Iran. They're the same people oppressing every minority group, and they're the same people oppressing the everyman and the everywoman of Iran. And again, so I don't believe that the people of Iran are inherently anti-Semitic in any way.
That's a great answer and a comforting answer. And we wish they had some power with which to operate on what they believe.
Shoshana, just one thing I just want to also share on that. Just recently, some colleagues of mine, former colleagues from the White House and State Department, Deputy Director at the NSC, Victoria Coates, and Senior Advisor to the Iran Action Group, Len Khodorkovsky, they just recently wrote a piece about the Cyrus Accords. And so I have to answer this question just to mention that I think what Victoria Coates and Len Khodorkovsky are sharing with the world is that there was a time when the Abraham Accords was also unimaginable, right? Many of us could not imagine the day that peace would actually come between Israel and her Arab neighbors, a warm peace, right? A warm peace with normalization. And here today, we see it unfolding in front of our eyes. I believe, as does Victoria Coates, as does Len Khodorkovsky, and I believe millions of others, that the Cyrus Accords are an absolute possibility, that there is a potential that one day we're going to see normalization between Iran and the state of Israel.
That was my next question. So that's good. But it goes to a slightly larger question also. And that is, if I were the Iranian government right now, the Abraham Accords would be giving me hives, because I'm now watching, even if I'm Shiite and they're Sunni, we all kind of hated Israel, so I kind of could count on them at some point, and now I can't. So how much of an impact did the Abraham Accords have on the thinking of the Iranian government? And does it increase their sense of, vulnerability, loneliness? Does it help make them unhappier than they were before?
Yeah, well, the Iranians, there were two parties that shared their immediate unhappiness. It was the Iranian regime and the Palestinian Authority. And so, yes, the Iranians were incredibly unhappy. They do understand that they're vulnerable, even more vulnerable than ever, because what the Accords did was, in essence, create a Sunni Gulf Arab alliance with Israel. And it is a major check on Iran's malign activities. It's a major check on Iran's desire for hegemony all over the Middle East. And so the Iranians do understand that. I also want to say, in the context of this question, the importance of the Abraham Accords. And again, peace in itself is just incredibly important, incredibly beautiful, and what an experience for us to have in our lifetimes. But in this context, the importance of the Abraham Accords, to me, is that it really shows the region in a divided way. You have a choice in this region. You're either on the side of peace, of security, and of building bridges between your people, or you're on the side of extremism, of radicalization, of hate and war. So those are, in essence, the two choices that the Accords the Abraham Accords kind of presented to the Middle East, North Africa region. And we see which countries are choosing the path of peace, and we see which countries are continuing on the path of extremism. And Iran, of course, is chief among them. I also want to note, when you look at that separation of those who are on the side of peace and those who are on the side of hate and radicalization, extremism, they are also, the extremists are also the failed states. And that is a very interesting thing to know.
That is. So we are coming to the end of our time together and to the last question. And let me say two things. First of all, we have an enormous number of questions that we are not going to get to in the webinar. I am going to ask our computer genius to please pull those questions off the Q&A function, and perhaps at some point you can answer them privately, because there's some good stuff in there and I feel bad for people who did that. So Michael, please. So the last question that I'm going to ask you to address as we close today, listeners know I like to end the program with a question that has a positive response from the speaker. So we end on a happy note, even if the subject wasn't particularly happy. Almost, but not quite today. You've talked a lot about what's happening in Iran. You've talked a lot about what the people need, what the people want, and how the regime tries to stymie what they do and what they want. We are Americans, or most of us are Americans, or all of us have the ability to address the American government. What should we be telling the American government? Should we be saying, do something here? What should we do as Americans or friends of America, or people who want to talk to our government?
Shoshana, I would say that we're at a very critical juncture right now, and most certainly everyone should do something by contact your members of Congress, contact the Biden administration, contact the White House, and let them know that indeed the very values of the United States of America is that we do stand for democracy, we do stand for freedom, we do stand for liberty, and we stand for fundamental human rights. And why should the people of Iran be denied these rights? Do they not count? Are they not human? Do they not exist? Do we think that they have no agency? Again, you know, we need to look at Iran as a country of individual humans, and they are being brutally oppressed and repressed. So yes, Shoshana, I do hope that everyone joining us today and anyone who will watch later will feel empowered, because there is much we can do. Look, you know, we're blessed. I'm blessed. I came here and I was given status as a refugee. I became a citizen of the United States. I was tapped to represent the government of the United States. I mean, truly the American dream. It doesn't happen anywhere else. And so we are blessed to live in a democracy. Let's get our voices heard.
That is as positive an answer as we could ask for. Ellie Cohanim, thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking to us. Thank you for enlightening us. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our program for today.
Thank you.